Hello, my friends. Our topic is unrecognized assumptions in astrology and how these assumptions can derail the consultation. Here's an example topic: sexuality. In Western medieval astrology, so if you go back hundreds of years ago, very often sexuality was associated with the fifth house. And to give an example of this, I'm going to quote from a website. I give the website address here at the bottom of this slide. The fifth house can be a primary house to look at for romance. This is the area of sexual pleasure, expression, and the dating phase of relationships. One's initial take with love, romance, and relationships can be found here. Okay, so what this person is saying is that the romance, the sexual pleasure, this romantic attraction, this honeymoon phase of relationships is in the fifth house. It can also allude to what a honeymoon phase of a relationship may look like or entail. It can also be an aspect of sexual pleasure that one engages in. It may even refer to the initial reaction or idea of what sexual pleasure and romance ought to be. Because the fifth house rules pleasure and creation, it can also refer to children. Okay, so this romantic attraction, sexual pleasure, and the results of sexual pleasure, children, are in the fifth house. This was a very common idea throughout the Middle Ages, and many astrologers still use this idea. Now, a very different idea of where sexuality is in the astrology chart. And you're probably familiar with this if you are involved in Western astrology, which is the eighth house. So to quote from another website, and I give the website address here at the bottom of the slide, the eighth house, the house of sex. Okay, see, the eighth house, not the fifth house, according to this source, is the house of sex. I'm going to talk about the assumptions, how and where these ideas come from, and the historical developments that led to these interpretations. But first, let's understand what the interpretations are. The eighth house is commonly referred to as the house of sex. Okay, so here sex is in the eighth house, not the fifth house. This house delves into relationships, interactions with another, and how certain aspects of those interactions can take on a more communal nature. It speaks to what our relationships will bring us and how we can get the most out of them. Returning to this house's emphasis on sex, it's important to note that the French refer to the orgasm as the little death. When we reach that exalted state of communion, we leave a little of ourselves behind, die a small death. One can also choose to view this as growth, a new beginning, the rebirth of the soul, or a gain for the partnership. So this intimacy of sexuality and losing a part of ourselves in the relationship, like a little death, this is sexuality. This is the core of sexuality. It's in the eighth house. Well, why do we have these two different ideas? I'm going to present you other ideas. Where do they come from? How do they develop? What's going on here? Well, Lee Lehman, who has a lot of expertise in medieval astrology, also modern astrology, and the history of astrology, she points out that sex was associated with the fifth house in medieval astrology. It was changed to the eighth house when astrology was revived in modern times. Okay, so the ancients did not talk so much about eighth house and sex. For some modern astrologers, you say sex, they say eighth house. Why this change from fifth to eighth house? What's going on here? Well, we can surmise some pretty obvious things here. Freudian theory. Freudian theory emphasizes that our conscious minds are just the tip of the iceberg. So this whole Freudian idea that we have this churning, large amount of unconscious energy, and just the tip of the iceberg is conscious. Well, astrologers want to know, where is this massive, churning, complex, unconscious with all of these unresolved problems and complexities going on? You have to find a place for it. So we want to know where this vast unconscious emotional power is in the birth chart. It was assigned to several things. One is the eighth house. The other is the planet Pluto and the zodiac sign Scorpio. So in this view, a big part of sexuality is it's a part of the reptilian brain. Animals have sex. It's a basic core instinct. And it's filled with complex feelings, the power of the cathexis, in other words, the bond that builds in infancy. It grows through our connections with our parents. And sexual energy gets sublimated in various activities. So in the Freudian perspective, we have these primal, animalistic needs, desires. And as civilized people, we learn how to channel those into our everyday life. And this creates a lot of tension and complexity. And sexuality is one of these very primal needs that gets complicated and needs to be adapted and rechanneled into our modern cultures. So this is the assumption. And a lot of astrologers who are associating sexuality with the eighth house do not know the history of this. They don't know where it came from. They don't know how it developed. And I learned this from Lee Lehman, who explained how, pretty obviously where this comes from if you read some of the original sources on the eighth house and sexuality. Very interesting. Now, this cauldron of intense desire and seething emotions is not just fun and sport. So in a lot of the Middle Ages, they were looking at sexuality as, this is the fun of life. What's more fun? What's more exciting? They were not thinking about this seething cauldron of complex emotions. So depending on what aspect of sexuality you tune into, you come up with different views of what sexuality is. And these are the assumptions that we don't even know we have. So when you're associating sexuality with the fifth house, you're inheriting, whether you know it or not, this lineage of ideas and this way of thinking about sexuality. And when you are using the eighth house as your idea of what sexuality is, even if you don't like Freudian theory, you are nevertheless influenced by it. Very interesting when we don't know the roots of the ideas and why they are there. And this also becomes very confusing for students of astrology because they hear all these different things. What happens with professional astrologers is they get comfortable with one particular lineage of ideas, they use it, and that's what they go with. Typically, that's what happens. So you have this divergence of opinion, these hidden assumptions, these implicit understandings built into the way that we're looking at astrology, and because of the different heritage of ideas, different astrologers using different interpretive techniques. So, is it the fifth house or is it the eighth house? Which perspective do you agree with? You can think about it. See what makes sense to you. More importantly, now here's the big point. More important than what you think, what does sexuality mean to your client? And in the title of this video, I said, how our assumptions could derail the consultation. Because maybe for some clients, they are looking at sexuality as this intimacy and this complexity and all these deep unconscious motivations getting involved and the complex ways in which sexuality develops, in even going back to infancy, according to Freud. This is all involved in it. Or is your client looking at sexuality as, that's fun. I think maybe that idea is not as popular. I don't know. But these are different ways of looking at it. And to realize that people have different ways of thinking of sexuality, even unconsciously, even just instinctively. Even if you ask them, they may not be able to articulate consciously what they're thinking of, what's going on. And also, to what extent is the astrology chart a depiction of our construct of the world? Maybe a lot of astrology is a way of framing our beliefs. So we have a belief about sexuality. Using Freudian theory, we find a way to project that or formulate it into a conceptual framework and a specific diagram. And we put it in the eighth house. Whereas other people are going to put sexuality in the fifth house. And other people are going to say it's a little bit of both. And depending on what aspect of sexuality it is, it can be eighth or fifth. But understanding the heritage of these ideas and the assumptions behind them can help you understand which way you want to approach it. And also, A big question that, frankly, I think astrologers often don't ask is the astrology accurate at all? Does the fifth house really have to do with playfulness and creativity and sexual pleasure? This is the idea. And does the eighth house have to do with all this complex, unconscious stuff? Now, this Freudian theory basically didn't exist. I mean, of course, specifically Freudian theory, but even some prototype concept of it, this was not a popular way of thinking by the astrologers in the Middle Ages. So our assumptions, our worldview, our belief about what people are, where our emotions come from, and how they operate affects our interpretation and what we're seeing in the chart. Now, here's an interesting thing. There's a TEDx talk called Revamp Your Sex Life by a lady named Ruth Ramsey. This is a popular video. It's 2.3 million views at the time I'm making this video in June 2024. And Ramsey suggests that treating your sex life as a fun hobby, instead of taking it so seriously and not being open about it, that if married couples treated their sex life as more like a hobby, something to experiment with, to get better at, to enjoy, to discuss. You can watch the video, and it's very compelling and engaging and interesting video about things like we're not open about sex. We can feel inadequate. We can worry about hurting the other person's feelings. We're taking it so seriously and so deeply, and so many sensitivities around sexuality. And she's saying, if you just lighten up and realize, there's sexuality and there's love and there's all kinds of things, why not just have fun with the sexuality? Why not talk about it? Why not see what you like? She just treat it like a tennis match where you would practice different things. And anyway, you can watch the video. But what's interesting, it's almost as if this lady, Ruth Ramsey, is saying if you treat sex as a fifth house activity rather than an eighth house activity, your sexual life will get better. Almost always. Interesting. It's just interesting that there are these two ideas in astrology, and now there's somebody talking about moving our frame of reference to sexuality to more of a fifth house perspective. Maybe, possibly, if someone watches that video and they say, "Oh yeah, this is a much better way for my partner and I to approach sexuality," maybe it becomes more of a fifth house experience for them. Wow, this is just really interesting to think about our assumptions, where they come from, how they develop, and how they influence the way we interpret the astrology chart. Now, here's a third way. These are not the only two ways of seeing sexuality in the chart, fifth house versus eighth house. There's also the seventh house. This is the most popular in Vedic astrology. And they also use the nakshatras for understanding sexuality. But to give you an idea, here I'm quoting from this website. I give the website address at the bottom of the slide. Sexual acts and behaviors depend on two factors: the sign, the zodiac signs, and the house placements, especially the seventh house. Okay, so here's the third idea. Fifth house, eighth house, now seventh house. And here are some of the interpretations. And this is very graphic, very specific. In this third approach, they're looking at sexuality, you might say biologically, like what actually happens during the sexual experience. And they're very explicit, very graphic, and not very psychological, and not very complicated about it. It's like this is just an activity, just like if you were saying, how does a person play a given sport? What aptitude do they have? Can they throw a ball fast? Can they catch the ball easily? It's like, what is the way a person's going to engage in sex? And a lot of the ancient astrology is very factual, just like bam, 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 this is the way it is. So, I'll read a few of these. If Moon or Venus is in the seventh house of the horoscope, then there will be a quick ejaculation during coitus. They tend to talk more about the men than the women in a lot of these things. If Sun is in the seventh house of the horoscope, there will be aggressive sex behavior. Whoa. If the moon is in the 7th house, the native is delighted in sex, but the ejaculation is quick. I told you, very specific, very graphic. You'll never read these kind of things in modern popular books. It's like they're very open and uninhibited about just describing the actual sexual activity. Mars in 7th, he will be impatient in sex, which ends quickly. Mercury suffers from premature ejaculation or nervous exhaustion, and so on. Wow. And then it goes on to Mars in the birth chart, especially Mars is related to the 7th house. So 3 different perspectives, thinking of it more like a biological function. What happens with a person given their chart in sex? With all of the emotion and complexity and relating and listening and communicating kind of stripped out. A 3rd perspective. I'm not saying Vedic astrologers don't look at that at all. I'm just saying this aspect of looking at sexuality is available in Vedic astrology. So here we see a description of physical sexual activity unrelated to emotion, simple, straightforward description of the details of the sexual experience. Now the 7th house is relationships that are partnerships, commitments. So in a lot of these historical traditions, they are assuming that sex is happening within marriage. Nowadays, it's not so true. People date and they will have sexual relationship and without being married. So again, it's influenced by the assumptions of the context of what we believe is happening. Maybe some of the 5th house rules work if people are looking at sex as fun. Maybe the 8th house rules work if people think of sexuality as a lot of unconscious and deep, complex material coming to the surface. And maybe 7th house works if it's sex within a committed relationship, within a marriage. So these astrologers are looking at sexuality on its own terms as a physical activity, these Vedic astrologers. They're not looking at it as entertainment and fun, and they're not looking at it as a place where the depth of our unconscious minds comes into full expression. Interesting how you can look at the same phenomenon through different lens, different set of assumptions. We all have assumptions. When your client asks you about sexuality, what comes to your mind? What do you think is are you thinking about the psychological, the communication, the understanding? There's so many different aspects to it and so many different assumptions. And what's very important is, what does it mean to the client? We should not assume that the client thinks the same way that we do. So many astrologers today analyze a marriage relationship in terms of the ability of the 2 people to communicate and understand each other, the ways that their temperaments are compatible or incompatible. So a lot of times when people ask about sexuality, the astrologer may start thinking about not specifically the sexual activity, but more the communication going on. This is what some people assume is going to be fundamental. What's interesting is, despite our sense of ourselves as sexually liberated in the 21st century, some of us may shy away from discussions that are so tangible, like the ones in the Vedic astrology. It's just interesting the different things people can focus on and assume are related to the question of sexuality. Okay, what do you think? It's up to you to decide among all these choices, and it gives you a better idea of how people, how different astrologers, why they're using different techniques and why they're emphasizing different things. And again, what does your client think, either consciously or unconsciously? What's influencing the client's attitude towards sexuality? And here's another thing. In the Vedic view, if you're consulting people with traditional spiritual values in India and other parts of the world, when you talk about sexuality, the issue of celibacy gets involved as well. That's not as common in modern Western thinking. Another issue that Western astrologers need to consider if consulting spiritual aspirants from India and some other places is the idea that abstinence from sexuality, even to the point of celibacy, is often seen as a great virtue. So this is something to be aware of if you're consulting people who have these this kind of understanding of sexuality. We need to respect the client's point of view and not just run right over it. So these different ways of interpreting actually address different assumptions about what's fundamental to a person. In these traditional spiritual beliefs, indulgence in lustful ways is regarded as extremely harmful to spiritual development. While having healthy and fulfilling sex can be seen as highly desirable in modern Western thinking, it can be seen as simply immersion in one of the traps of the material world for people who are immersed in various ancient religious beliefs. I'm not saying that everyone who has these ancient beliefs shares this point of view. I'm not saying anything like that. All I'm saying is that some people think like this. Some. You can decide for yourself how many there are, but they are there. People who are thinking, oh, when you're talking about sexuality, you're talking about just immersion in the sense pleasure of the physical world. And that's not the end game. That's not the be-all and end-all. That's not even the goal. So there's different ways of thinking that are involved. And a lot of times when we talk about, well, where's sexuality in the astrology chart, we jump right to a certain, we say, oh, it's the 5th house, oh, it's the 8th house, 7th house. All of these assumptions about what sexuality means and what's important to the person. And I give a website here at lightonvedicastrology.com where there's a discussion about this. What I'm presenting to you is the different assumptions, the beliefs, the built-in, you might even say biases, the built-in assumptions is really the best word, of what is fundamental. Now there's other views. There's the romantic view of sexuality. Another view of sexuality is that it is a kind of epiphenomenon. It's just something that bubbles up. It's born out of people being in love. So when you mention sexuality to some people, what they're thinking is, oh, sexuality is something that happens only if you're in love. It's kind of getting to be an old-fashioned idea. The romantic view, like, oh, you're going to fall in love. And then part of being in love is sexuality. From this point of view, being in love is the central issue. So if you're talking to someone who looks at sexuality as part of being in love, and they ask about sexuality, they are really asking about when they will fall in love or who they're falling in love with, and then how the sexuality will be expressed within that context. People think in different ways, and as consultants, it's more important for us to understand the client, resonate with the client, appreciate the client, and work with the client in their worldview. And not so much for us to impose our worldview on them and help them get to some healthy, constructive life from within the context of how they operate. And these are different ways that people operate. For some people, there's not going to be sex without romance. Or if there is, it's going to be completely unsatisfying. Some people put so much emphasis on being in love as the fundamental thing. Also, from this point of view, there are questions like how do you stay in love, which might require communication skills, might require attentiveness to the partner. It can involve commitment, faithfulness, not cheating, accepting the person as they are, all kinds of things to keep that flame of being in love alive. These might be issues with the goal of staying in love, and then the sexuality takes care of itself from this point of view. So these kind of assumptions that we rarely talk about in astrology, and people just say, well, tell me about the sexuality, and then they pick one of these frames of reference and they run with it. So from this point of view, the romantic point of view, Venus is often seen as the key to sexuality for both men and women. Mars might be involved as something that Venus is attracted to, but for some astrologers having the romantic view, Venus as attraction to beauty, the attracting power that can also lead to feeling in love, is the key issue, more than the house. The house would just tell you how that attraction works. So different perspectives, different attitudes on what's going on. And again, what's important is what does sexuality mean for your client? And let me emphasize this. What sexuality means to the client might be instinctive and not easily verbalized. They might not even be able to articulate. It could just be taken for granted. It's like a built-in mechanism. So just asking the client, do you look at sexuality as A, B, C, D, E? The client may not have even thought about these things. So what's really going on with the client? What's the preference? What's going on? These become important issues to address what the client is interested in. The assumptions. And how, if we get the assumptions wrong, it derails the consultation. Because the client has a different perspective, a different attitude, a different set of priorities than what we may be assuming. Just something to be aware of. Another way of looking at sexuality is as an energetic, we can call this the energetic point of view. The energetic connection between people may be the most important thing. So it may be, if we look at the person as having, like, say, an aura with all this energy flow, when there's a sexual relationship, what is the energy exchange, the immersion into each other? And it can be approached from that point of view. Not so much in the Freudian way of what's unconscious or whatever, or the like biology of it, you might say, that from the Vedic point of view or whatever, but what kinds of connections are going on? So, there's another thing to be aware of when we talk about sexuality and romance. It's often assumed when the astrologer looks at the chart and they say, your sun and moon are in fire signs, and your partner's sun and moon are in fire signs. Oh, this is great, you're so compatible. There's some work being done recently by psychologists. I forgot to look up their names. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the discussion. Some of the psychologists working on this, where they've researched couples, exhaustive research, to see who's happy and who's not. And very often what's going on, according to this very detailed research, is something that contradicts our common sense, our intuition. We think that we want someone compatible. People look for someone compatible. They go to a dating site looking for someone. We both like this, we both like this, we both like this. And what the researchers are finding is, you know what you get from that? A friend. There's a big difference between a friend and a romantic partner. Interesting. And very often we're attracted to someone, actually, no, that's not what the research says. What the research says is those relationships where that fire, that burning fire of desire and care and attention and being good to one another, ironically, is often between people who are kind of different. They're not so much the same. And when I did research on zodiac sign compatibility of over 20,000 married couples, I was finding the quincunx showing up more than anything else. I'll put a link to that video in the discussion as well. And I thought, this is just random fluctuation. This can't be. Then I saw the videos about how relationships with somebody different actually works out well. Interesting. Okay, so I'll make a separate video about how astrologers and dating services have often gotten it backwards by insisting you want so much the same, when the research is showing lasting relationships, they often have a lot that's different. I suspect a combination of some things the same and some things different is kind of the ideal situation. And it seems to show up astrologically as well. And going back to that energetic view of astrology, maybe it's the synastry that's really determining what's going on. Not so much just, we have what signs we have in common, because they seem to have very little to do with it. It's whatever synastry happens, and we fall in love. People will fall in love with someone that they didn't expect to fall in love with. They thought they wanted a person who's this, and this, and they fall in love with someone very often who's very different from their checklist. It's the energetics that happen to be there. So there are all these views on what goes on with sexuality. And you can decide which ones make the most sense, and most importantly, be aware of how the client is viewing sexuality, both consciously and you might say instinctively, what might be going on. So concluding comments. Very often the astrologer has assumptions about what is important to people in general, in anything, sexuality, job, whatever. What issues arise in personal relationships, sexual relationships, and what the best overall solutions are. I know astrologers who assume a psychological developmental point of view where they look at the chart and say, oh, this went on with your mother, this went on with your father. That it's all about your developmental process and what has made you psychologically healthy or unhealthy. Well, some clients are interested in that and some are not interested in that. So you need to consider, do you want to talk about something the client is not interested in? Maybe you do, but you need to consider that. Don't assume that that's so important to everyone. Or don't assume becoming empowered in the world and being successful in the world is the number one thing. People are built differently. They have different frames of reference based on where they live, how they grow up, and their astrology charts, everything. So we need to be flexible and adaptable and be aware that a lot of our different astrological ideas are pointing out what something means according to different assumptions. And then there's also the whole question about whether the astrology is even accurate or not. Is the 8th house related to the unconscious? In medieval astrology, it was just death and a few other things. So different views of what is even going on. Maybe a lot of astrology is just a projection of a psychological concept, a psychological framework for understanding people. So if we spend more time understanding the world that the client lives in and what their value system is and what their priorities are, then we can be better able to help the client achieve the goals that is important to the client rather than what's important to us. Okay, so thank you very much. Just some ideas to consider about the assumptions we have when we interpret a chart and how our assumptions sometimes derail the consultation. Thank you very much. If you're a subscriber, thank you. It helps get more views. The more subscribers we have, the more YouTube recommends the videos. It really helps. There's also a membership if you want to meet with me once a month or twice a month. There's 2 different programs with questions and answers and have live interaction. And there's a fee for that. But of course, there are over 700 videos. They're all free, and just becoming a subscriber really helps as well. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.